Good morning and welcome. Hello, I'm Liv Corman with the Newberry. Um, to everyone in the room and tuning in on Zoom, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to take a second and ask everyone to silence your phones, please. And I want to share a little bit about our co-sponsor for the event. The Colonial History Lecture Series is co-sponsored by the Society of Colonial Wars in the state of Illinois, in partnership with the History Department at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. The Society for Colonial Wars is a national historic and genealogical organization with more than 4,000 members who trace their ancestry to a soldier, sailor, or government official who served in America between 1607 and 1775. Its mission is to perpetuate the memory of those who served, as well as events of the colonial war era. It also educates the public about the period by sponsoring lectures and publications and offering financial support to colonial-era researchers and authors. The Society and the Newberry Library have presented the Colonial History Lecture Series together since 2016. We have a lot to offer at the Newberry outside of this program. I'd encourage you to take a look at some of the other public programs we have going on, our free exhibition, and our adult education courses. We also have the Welcome Center open today, so it's easy to get a free reader's card if you're interested in learning more about our collection. The Native Pop exhibit is open right now in the gallery space, right next to the lobby. Programs like this are free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of our community of donors. To support our work, consider making a gift to the Newberry. Finally, we're going to have a Q&A session for a few minutes after the speakers are done talking today. If you are interested in asking a question, please text your questions so we can get everyone in the virtual space and in the room a fair chance to ask questions. After the discussion, Serena will be in the lobby signing copies of her book, which is available in the Newberry bookshop. There's also the independent bookstore crawl going on today, so make sure to check out what they have going on. And I'm going to pass it over to Aaron Barlow of the Society of Colonial Wars in Illinois. Thank you.
Thank you, Liv. Yes, I'm Aaron Barlow. I'm the chair of the Speakers Committee at the Society of the Colonial Wars. And as Liv said, we are a patriotic lineage society focused on the colonial era. And part of our mission, an important part of our mission, is to promote greater awareness of history in the colonial period. We are therefore extremely pleased to co-sponsor these colonial lectures with the Newberry Library and the Department of History at the University of Illinois. The lectures have addressed many different aspects of colonial history. Our funding and support for these lectures is one of the most important things our society does. So we're very proud of it, and it's very important to us. Our speaker today is Serena Zabin. She's professor in the history department at Carleton College. She received her bachelor's degree in the classics at Bowdoin College, followed by a master's degree in Latin from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She then went on to Rutgers University, where she received a PhD in early American history. She has numerous publications in early American history, including her award-winning book, The Boston Massacre, A Family History, published in 2020, which is the subject of our discussion today. Our program today will be a discussion between Professor Zabin and Susie An, a reporter for Chicago's WBEZ Radio. Ms. An covers for WBEZ, she covers state and suburban education and also serves as an occasional news anchor and show host on WBEZ. She's directed shows like Schools on the Line, a past WBEZ call-in show focusing on education in Chicago. Her work has been heard on NPR, CBC, and the BBC. Susie joined WBEZ as a news desk intern in 2007. She has won awards from the Associated Press and Chicago Headline Club, and she received her bachelor's degree in journalism from University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. Please join me in welcoming Serena Zabin and Susie An.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us this morning. The Boston Massacre of March 5th, 1770, an event that led to the American Revolution, is often presented to us in history books as that pivotal moment in which British soldiers fired upon Boston colonialists, killing 5 people. The incident, fueled by mounting tensions between the colonies and Great Britain, became a powerful symbol of British oppression and became a catalyst for revolutionary sentiment. But what often gets lost in this account is the connections between the British Army and Bostonians. Serena Zabin's latest book, The Boston Massacre, A Family History, dives into those complexities, and we're happy to have her here to dive even further into the people's history of this historic event. Serena, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for being here, and those of you who are sitting, I hope, in your pajamas watching this. Yeah, thank you for taking the time to come talk.
Congratulations on the book. I know that it has been a few years, but I feel like the COVID years don't really count. So congratulations, you're still in order.
We'll forget them.
Well, so let's jump right in. People are generally familiar with Paul Revere's account of the Boston Massacre. What did you hope to reveal with this book?
So I think we can, get rid of our faces. And I think you probably all remember, actually, this incredibly famous picture, this engraving, one of the most famous engravings from 18th century America. And it's so vivid. It tells such a strong story, right? And you can see it tells the story really of aggression by soldiers shooting these, very innocent looking, civilians, clearly unarmed, this like woman sitting in the middle, standing in the middle, right? Which is sort of an indication that, this is a safe crowd of people, right? A lone woman is going to be fine there. So it tells the story about, this is basically British aggression on, these innocent colonials. And if you missed the idea, you can see here that, Revere's like, look, I'm going to rename the customs house, because he blames in part the kind of larger colonial imperial administration for this. I'm going to rename it Butcher's Hall. But what I wanted to point out in this picture, really, in the book, is that, other pieces of the story that we don't pay that much attention to is also part of his, sort of maybe what we would call propaganda. So the biggest piece is this like line, the white line of gun smoke that divides soldiers and civilians. And the story that I wanted to tell was that this line is part of the same piece of propaganda, right, as the kind of Butcher's Hall piece, that really soldiers and civilians had relationships that were far more mixed and far more intimate than what this picture showed. So that's what I was really trying to get across, is that 1770 wasn't yet a moment where people thought, oh, the British are over there, we're Americans and we're over here, and that die is already cast. And that's not what Boston looked like in 1770.
Well, to that point, in your research, were you surprised to see all the mixing between soldiers and civilians at that time?
I really was so surprised. I had no idea. And some of the stuff was so obvious that I'm a little embarrassed now. But this book came out of a class that I teach to first-year students at Carleton College that I call Trials in Early America. And we used to, and sometimes we still do, the term, people would read John Adams's notes on the trials, and then I'd divide them in half, and the students would take, one half would be the defense and one half would be the prosecution, and then they'd act it out. And like in Chicago and Minnesota, by the end of winter term or fall term, there was usually snow. They could like act out the whole thing with snowballs and red bathrobes and hockey sticks, and it was super fun. But at some point, this person in special collections said, we actually have one of the original pamphlets about the Boston Massacre. You should bring your students down to take a look. So we did, and for a couple of years, I asked them to read it, and I didn't really, I think, pay enough attention to it, because the very first deposition in it says, that the person giving the deposition of Bostonians said there was a soldier's wife sitting in the kitchen of this neighbor, and she said, "Oh, blood is going to run in the streets of Boston." And it took me a couple of years to really sit back and think, who is this soldier's wife? Like, why is she sitting in someone's kitchen, in a Bostonian's kitchen? And once I started asking that question, then I started seeing the connections everywhere. But before that, I had no idea. I just, sort of hung out with the engraving and with the trial record. And the trial record tells the same story as the engraving in a lot of ways, right? That soldiers are on one side and civilians are on the other. So it took a little digging.
Well, I'm going to get more into that interconnection, but I wanted to talk about family, which is a central theme in the book. I mean, it's part of the title of Family History. What do you mean by family in the context of the Boston Massacre?
So I mean two things by family. It does a lot of that term does a lot of work for this book. So some of it is in fact exactly what it sounds like. The fact that really struck me that I had not known before were the number of soldiers who actually married local women, right, and created marriages there. Even more families who had children while they were in Boston. So the troops are in Boston for about 17 months before the shooting. And in that year and a half, when those soldiers had children, they brought them to the local church to be baptized, or one of the local churches. And they often asked Bostonians to serve as godparents, right? So they're creating these sort of fictive families. And they traveled, armies traveled with families, as you can see in this watercolor from 1780. You can see that woman in the blue skirt, right, and the man carrying his kid on his back. So sometimes I just mean families, like they made families in Boston. But the other piece, which I think many of you probably know, is that in the 18th century, the language of family is kind of the language of politics, right? I mean, that's why people are talking about the mother country, right? People are talking about the colonies as disobedient children. People talk all the time about the king as father, right? So at the same time that soldiers and civilians are making families, they're also trying to figure out, what does it mean to live within this imperial family? And that's what the shooting sort of opens up. And we're like, maybe I don't like this family so much after all. But it does, it means something both very political and something very personal.
Absolutely. That was something I found fascinating in the book is how you characterize the relationships during this point in history, the relationships between families, government, soldiers, and civilians. Talk about that and why it was important to know about these various types of relationships.
So I think that if we don't understand, right, that these events that look to us so set in stone or carved out of metal or whatever we want to think of them, right, as actually events that are created by people, right? And empires are really nothing more than people, right? Doing things, living in structures they can't always see. But in the end, the British Empire was made up of just folks, right? And so I wanted us to see how did it work to actually create and pull apart a colony from an empire, right? And so I think it really needed to see people connected to each other. And I think it really matters for us to know that in 1770, nobody thought that the empire was over, right? That everybody still thought of themselves as British, and they may have called themselves, which they also did, by a local kind of association. They thought of themselves as Bostonians, or they thought of themselves as people from Massachusetts, but nobody really thought of themselves as different from British, right? And so that's part of that story of connection that happens throughout these marriages and these family formations.
I want to take us out of the history timeline for a moment and talk about process. As a journalist, I love stumbling upon just great sources, great source material during research. And clearly there was a lot that you stumbled upon for your book. What were your major sources for the book?
I had so much fun doing the research for this book. So the the most important source, which surprised me honestly, were muster rolls. So those of you who work and through these genealogical projects understand, I think, how useful they are. But I hadn't realized how nice it is to work with a military history where actually like people keep lists. Right, my last book was much less formal than that. But it turns out that, that muster rolls, which are really just lists of guys' names, are super revealing. So one of the things that was so surprising to me is they write down when guys desert, right? And desertion is desertion, it sort of depends a little bit on your perspective, right? So if you are an ensign whose job it is to like list out, which guys are actually available for duty, desertion means like you're not there and you really have violated the terms of what you're supposed to be doing, right? But if you are a young man who's married a local, desertion may look much more like you're putting your family first. Sort of depends on where you are. But looking at the desertion records was surprising to me. I mean, something like 20% of the troops desert, which is nuts, right? Like nowhere else in North America does it ever look like that. And then I could trace many of these men into marriage records in other parts of Massachusetts, right? They left and they end up marrying like literally the farmer's daughter, right? Whose farm they go to work on during harvest time. So that to me was super surprising and so useful.
Just seeing these names pop up in different documents.
Exactly. Yeah. So it took a bit. Did I put? Yeah. So I thought I would just show.
I hope everyone is amazed by this because I am.
The back of my database, because what I started realizing was as these names kept popping up that I needed to know who they were. And really, it was only because there was a sergeant whose name was Joseph Laff, which is such an unusual name that first he showed up in some legal records, right? I think he's accused of theft. And then I saw him again in something else, and I thought, well, that is an unusual name. And I wondered how many other connections there were that I wasn't tracing because the names weren't sufficiently unusual. So then I put the names of these 2,000 men in a database and then started just making connections. And so that's what the book is sort of based on, this database of interlinked relationships.
I also loved reading you came across a number of old newspaper articles, and I really enjoyed the back and forth between people, either someone anonymously writing an article against someone else in town, but everyone finding out who it was, or maybe someone being falsely accused of being the author of this anonymous article. Did you have a favorite interaction among these?
Oh, God, there's a couple, and I love this question, right? This sort of journalist question, right? Because like, oh, think about the newspapers. I mean, historians so often just extract data out of newspapers, right? Instead of thinking about them actually as sources and as things that are interesting unto themselves. So I think maybe there's two. So one is there's a hilarious sort of battle of doggerel, right? So people wrote so much bad poetry, and I'm just an enormous fan of terrible poetry. And so they would write these competing pieces of doggerel, like about a social event, right? About who actually did dance with whom at this particular party. And it becomes kind of political because sometimes the officers are mad at being offended, insulted, or they insult local women, and then somebody comes back. And so there is actually kind of a brawl at a newspaper office when one officer goes in demanding to know who wrote this poem, who was that, because they're all anonymous, that insulted him. And then the newspaper printed an account of the brawl. I mean, so that was super fun. And then the other one that I just found spectacular is this is a world, right, in which some people like today are, very politically attuned and some people are not, right? That's just sort of how it goes. But the people who are really politically attuned in the late 1760s, early 1770s in Boston are organized into the Sons of Liberty, right? And they're actually like a club, kind of a drinking club in which they talk, right? So they do both things at once. And but one of the things they do is produce these anonymous newspaper articles, right, in which they are listing out all of the terrible offenses that soldiers are doing, right? They are so angry that soldiers have been sent to Boston. They've been sent there to pacify, right, as kind of a peacekeeping force, and but the Sons of Liberty see this as a real misuse of imperial authority, right? They're like, look, the king should not be bringing soldiers to police its own people, his own people. So they're really very angry about it. So they write these articles in which they're, anonymously, they give these anonymous tips about terrible things that officers and other soldiers do. And one of them is about a guy who finds his granddaughter in bed with a soldier. And most people have read that as fiction because it's super over the top. But there's actually another man whose name is Harbottle Door, which is such an amazing name. And he annotated all the newspapers as they came through for like 30 years. They're sitting in the Massachusetts Historical Society, although they actually have now all been scanned and they're online. So he goes through and he writes in the names of all of the people, right, who are involved in this. And it's true. So the newspaper article doesn't use people's names because it's so crude. So it says Mr. L, and he writes next to it Lazenby. He writes out all of the names. It's very funny. So that I did really love too.
Real champion of history, that man.
He really was. He knew what he was doing.
Well, largely this takes place in Boston, but you do talk about different places, and some places are more dreadful than others. Why is it valuable to understand the various places in the book and the movement from one to the next?
Yeah. So one thing that I just wanted people to understand is that part of the way that the British Empire is working and is held together in the 1760s has to do with the movement of troops around the empire. So they come up with this plan, kind of these mid-level administrators in London in the 1760s after the end of the 7 Years' War, that no regiment is going to stay too long in any one place, right? They want to make sure that people don't put down roots, but they really do think that the movement of people is part of what's going to tie together an empire. So they, regularly, they forget about some troops, which, like the troops that have been forgotten are very sad about this. But they regularly move people around, and one of the places they move them to is Halifax, which is to anybody coming even from Northern England, even from Ireland, they think is horrible. So people, when they hear they're being sent to Halifax, they desert. The officers are all like, I'm sorry, my mommy needs me. They have many other reasons they can't go to Halifax. They think it's going to be so depressing. And it kind of is. Like, actually, the barracks are all, kind of rotten. People claim they're sleeping on leaves, and there's nothing to do. So really, they just drink very heavily. And they believe that if you drink enough sort of fortified wine, it will keep you from getting scurvy, right? And so there are these great letters from officers who are like, well, fortunately, I didn't get any scurvy because I really kept up my drinking. Okay. So, Halifax is a huge bummer, right? So partly because it's cold. So for that matter is the West Indies, right, where they're also sent. So in the 1770s, there's a number of attempts to put down these wars with Native people and mixed race people, especially what are known as the Carib Wars of 1772, 73. And that too, they're like, this place is awful. I think it's a family show, so I won't actually directly quote what they say, but they are, they're horrified. I mean, St. Vincent's, they're like, this place is terrible. So, but they move around, and as they move, they see different parts of the empire, and they get to know different parts of the empire. Boston actually is a pretty good posting. They're pretty happy with that one, except for the job, right? Like the problem with the job of why people were sent, why troops are sent to Boston, is they're sent to, like I said before, like to be a peacekeeping force, right? Because there have been these protests and riots against the customs officials, and they think there's a lot of smuggling. They think, well, maybe they can sort of control some of what's going on in the ports. But any officer who like reads anything knows that urban policing is not what the British Army was set up to do in the 1770s. And every time they're sent to London or to any city in Ireland or in Scotland, somebody gets shot, and then the officer in charge gets in trouble. And so, again, all of those officers are like, I'm sorry, I need a home leave. My grandma's dying. I mean, seriously, like day after day, the general in charge keeps getting these letters from officers who are like, I gotta go, because nobody wants responsibility for Boston.
That leads me to this next question, which soldiers and their families were primarily sent to Boston. They lived there. And that seems to have played a major role in creating those interconnections and relationships between soldiers and civilians. Can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
more about that?
Yeah, so this is, again, Revere showing the soldiers coming into Boston. So they're like marching down the Long Wharf. It's like they parked at the aquarium, essentially, for those of you who know Boston, right? And they're just, this big red coated line, marching into the heart of the city. There's all those steeples to remind the viewer that Boston's a super God-fearing place, right? That's so who are the good people. And so they come in, and this is what Boston looked like in 1770. It's not, it's only about a square mile, and the soldiers want to, or really the officers and the governor, want the soldiers to be living right in the heart of Boston, right in the middle of it, because that's where the riots are, right? That's where all the people are, and they think, oh, that's what's going to keep down the protests. But out here in Boston Harbor is where the barracks are, and the barracks got built using Massachusetts tax money during the 7 Years' War, right? And they were just refurbished, and the selectmen of Boston say, those are perfectly nice barracks. We just redid them. And that's where soldiers are supposed to go. That's what the law says. The Quartering Act, that is at this point part of the British legal code, says that actually soldiers have to be placed first in barracks, right, whenever they come to a place. After that, if there's not enough room in the barracks, they go in public houses, and only after that can they be put in private homes, right? And the governor and the commanding officers are like, look at how far it is, right? We'd have to row 3 miles or march 7 through mud. Like, this is like every time there's a riot, that's not going to work for us. So they come up with a compromise, after kind of a longer story that I won't do here, where the army ends up renting rooms from Bostonians. So this is, kind of the center of Boston where they hope they're going to be living. And they end up renting empty warehouses. Certainly that's most convenient, but also any spare room, any extra shed, whatever, in someone's backyard, they're putting soldiers. So the blue boxes are the kind of big spaces, that warehouses, whatever, where they put a lot of guys. But then, there's just 1 or 2 soldiers, or maybe a family, living with Bostonians in some of these red dots. It's like Boston turned into like the whole world of Airbnb, right? Has just like come into Boston. And as they're living together is how actually these soldiers come to meet all these Bostonians, right? They're literally living in the same rooms.
Wow. Well, I wanna turn now to women during this time. In a historical context, we don't often hear about the women and the role that they played, but you do an excellent job of really giving these women, telling their stories, giving them a well-rounded character and textured lives. What have standard historical accounts missed by not sharing the actual role of women during this time? And, why were women often left out in these
Yeah.
stories?
I mean, I think I spent a lot of time thinking about like why are women so often left out of these stories, right? Like through human history, women really do represent something like half the population, right? Like that's just otherwise we wouldn't be here. And so it's always been unclear to me, like why is it that we talk about the past as though half the people aren't there? Always seems super strange, even when I was a kid. And then, I mean, I came to understand, of course, like who has power, who gets to make choices, right? And so we often tell the story of power, right? That tends to be what history so often looks like. But when we do that, we miss actually how the world works, right? I mean, power is, of course, part of what makes the world go round. But their power, I also think of always is not just captured by one small group of people, right? It sort of runs throughout all different kinds of lives. So, one of the powers that women had in the 18th century actually was choices about marriage, right? Who were they going to marry? What decisions did that make? What implications did it have? So, turns out when you start thinking that, oh, women are actually part of this story, let's just notice them. So, for example, here's um, a another watercolor, this one of, the army in, just in an encampment. And you can see all these kids, all these women, like women traveled, they were part of the 18th century army. They get paid, right? Partly to do, mostly to do laundry, but some cooking also. They travel, they get travel allowance, all of the things. They're part of the army. The army's a family institution. So you have to start thinking, well, okay, so if these women are actually there, what's that going to change, right? So it turns out that it means that the fighting force isn't just, men coming in looking to shoot guns, right? It turns out that when the 18th century army comes, they're moving in, right? So then all of a sudden you have a way more complicated, much more fraught relationship. No, more fraught's the right word, but it's a lot more people who can have conflicts with each other, but also it provides this way of understanding what an army was trying to do as it's trying to exercise imperial power, right? And really, what it's trying to do is remind people that they are part of an empire. So, I mean, and it depends on who you look at. So, for me, this is one of the most amazing images, right? Like, okay, women are doing laundry, and it kind of looks like fun, right? Just not my vision of laundry. But, the idea that part of what's happening here is not just people doing work, right? But also people enjoying each other, people having fun together, right? And that's also part of our history.
Yeah, there were a number of women that you write about in the book. Did you have favorites or women that really stood out to you in your research?
I I did. I mean, the one that really stood out to me is this woman with whom I opened the book, a woman named Jane Chambers, in part because she was such a gift. I was able to trace her through all the places the regiment um, traveled, which is kind of amazing, right? She's illiterate as far as we know. At least she leaves no writing. She doesn't sign anything. Um, but I could trace her from Cork, which is where they embark. She's part of the 29th Regiment, to Halifax, and then to Boston. And in Boston, I found her through some of there's medical records from actually Warren, from Dr. Warren, right? He treats some of these soldiers. They have a daughter with smallpox, and at one point when people get smallpox, of course, right, they're isolated, they're put in a pest house out in Boston Harbor, and not everyone makes it, of course. And so in the Boston Public Library, I found this little scrap of paper, a receipt, right, literally a receipt from the Boston sexton to the selectman, I think it is, asking for payment for burying just what he calls a soldier's child. But the date actually corresponds to the dates that I knew she had gone out there with her child, and her child died. And I sat in the archive and cried. I felt that I had really gotten to know Jane. I had followed her on this trek and followed her as she, paid this money that it felt like they didn't really have to try to treat their kids for smallpox, and then one of them is just left in an unmarked grave, has no name, out in Boston Harbor, and that I found so moving. And she just kept going. I mean, Jane really had no choice, right? She went back to her husband, her other children, and ends up in Florida, which nobody likes either. And yeah, I don't actually know when she died, but she makes it pretty far through the story.
Well, I mean, that's incredible what you can really infer from these different points in time with the documents. Are there other characters that you discovered along the way, women or men, that you found interesting?
I mean, I love this. There's this guy named William Clark, who's the one that's found in bed with the granddaughter of, and he's such a character. Partly because he sees himself as an aspiring playwright. He's a private, and but about, I think, something from looking at signatures, I think maybe about half the privates are literate. But he actually writes a play soon after they come to Boston. He tries to get it published by a local printer that he calls the Miser, and then he he's a drama kind of guy, and so he's like found in bed, like I said, by this grandfather, and then he sort of claims that they end up getting married by someone that his wife says is dressed as a priest, which I've always thought, like, wonder about that one. And so and then the father is so upset. I mean, the father's also like a real, like, son of liberty, like not up for the idea that his daughter has just married a British soldier, that he, his health fails supposedly, but he confronts him. And then Clark takes a loaded pistol and shoves it in his father-in-law's chest, right? He's like, don't talk to me like that. And so then he ends up going to prison for a bit. He can't pay the fine. The captain, who's in charge, Preston, who's in charge the night of the shooting, is in jail already for the shooting at this point, ends up paying his fine, getting him out. And then when he's finally transferred, he writes this tell-all memoir, which sadly we don't have, but we do have the advertisement for it, in which he lists out, he's like, these are like the hardships of, my life, and especially made terrible by my in-laws, whom he names. He gives their address. It goes on. He is just a character. So I really enjoyed him. But I wanted people to understand, even in this moment that people die, even in this moment that the Sons of Liberty are like, oh my God, the sky is falling, that things were funny, right? People had fun. I didn't want us to forget that about the past.
Yeah, I think that shows you the family relationship doesn't get more complicated than that. So that's
no, not at all. Those of you who have issues with your sons-in-law, you can remember.
And then reveal it in a tell-all. That's amazing. Yes. Well, from where we sit now, of course, we can say there was just a lot of confusion and chaos that led to the Boston Massacre. So set the scene for us, March 5th, 1770, in the way that you describe in the book, and how should we be thinking or maybe rethinking about the events that led up to that point and the aftermath?
Yeah. So do I have Revere again? Yes, for us to think about. So Okay, so March 5th of 1770 is sort of in no way preordained, right, as a moment of shooting. So in fact, I mean, there are other like near misses, right, where people sort of almost shoot their guns, people almost have conflicts that get out of hand, but they don't, right? And at this point, the army starts to think, oh, maybe we've dodged the bullet here, right? They sent half the troops. There's 4 regiments at one point in Boston. 2 of them leave the summer before because it looks like everything's calmed down, and nobody knows this is going to happen, right? But there have been a number of other conflicts. There absolutely are people who are feeling irate and annoyed with each other. Boston is 16,000 people or so at this point, and it's about a square mile, right? It's about the same density that Boston has now, to be honest. And and then there's like 2,000 soldiers and several hundred women and children with them. Like, it's tense. People, there's a lot of potential for conflict. And so, that's always there. But the night of March 5th, like why this turns into a shooting is not anything obvious, right? So it's hard to know exactly what happened that night, partly because Boston doesn't have any streetlights at this point, right? It's dark. I mean, you all can imagine March at 9 o'clock. It's not that different from here. So, there are people on the street, and there's sentries in front of the customs house. That's absolutely true. But the the sentry knows most of the people who are walking by at this point. He's been there for 18 months. People walk by. He chats with them. He's like, "How's your family? What's going on?" Like, he knows a lot of these people. So they come by, and then a bunch of younger kids, teenagers come by, right? And they start making fun of the sentry because he's like stuck there, and they get to walk around. They maybe are throwing snowballs. It's a little unclear. It sort of depends on who you ask. They do seem to start harassing him, and more people start coming. And the sentry feels sort of increasingly pressed up against the wall. A woman comes out from the sort of tavern next door. She's like, "What's going on?" He's like, "I don't know. I'm hearing other conflicts. I'm getting a little worried. I think maybe you should leave. This doesn't feel like a good situation." And eventually he calls for backup from the kind of place where there's more soldiers essentially around the corner. A file of guys come out along with the captain of the day, and as they're marching, sort of just, it's really just a block up around what's now the old State House, they also see people they know. They see their neighbors. They see these other Bostonians who say to them, "What's going on?" They're like, "Oh, no idea. Like, just got called out." And, meanwhile, somebody starts ringing church bells, which can mean lots of things because it's just a bell, right? So it sometimes means fire, and Boston has had a big fire in the 1760s. They weren't supposed to rebuild with wood, but lots of people do, so there's still a lot of wood left, a lot of wood structures. So some people think there's a fire. They're yelling, "Fire, where's the fire?" Some people think that this is a riot. It's a call for a riot. So more and more people collect in what's essentially the central square in front of what was then called the townhouse, where the soldiers were. And, and really nobody knows what happened next. At some point, everyone agrees the word fire comes out, right? But it's dark, it's chaotic. Are people saying, "Where's the fire?" Some people are yelling at the soldiers, "You don't dare fire." They know that soldiers can't fire without a command, and so they're taunting them, right? But the soldiers claim that what they heard was a command to fire, right? And so at some point, they fire, right? Guns go off, and when the smoke clears, which doesn't quite look like this, but when the smoke in a much more chaotic world clears, what they see are essentially, some people dead and other people pretty much just bleeding out on the snow in front of, the kind of seat of imperial power. And that is really upsetting, right? It's like watching people, whatever, die on the steps of the Capitol. I mean, that's what it felt like. And so that's, it's not it's not a lot of deaths. I have a colleague who works on whatever, Russian history, and he's like, a massacre is, since when is a massacre 5 people, right? But but I think it's not the numbers, right? It's the horror. It's the horror of watching soldiers shoot civilians, right? Right there, right where the imperial power actually represents itself. And that is the part that really becomes political very quickly. It's not obvious that it's going to be. In fact, soldiers and civilians keep marrying, right? Like, it doesn't end the relationships between soldiers and civilians. What it ends or starts to end is the relationship between colony and empire.
And I want to remind the audience we'll be taking questions in just a moment, so you can get those ready. I think we have a slide for the numbers right there. You can text those, so you can go ahead and text those in. I want to talk about the aftermath. As you wrote about the trial and the court depositions, there is a lot of complexities there too.
Yeah. I mean, so the trial is, kind of John Adams's, most famous moment, right? So you probably all remember vaguely that Adams takes on, along with Josiah Quincy, who will die before the revolution really gets started, but also a son of liberty, they take on the defense of the soldiers and the captain, right? And they claim they're asked to do this by the Sons of Liberty. The whole idea is that they're going to take the high road, right? They're going to show that actually these guys are truly, right, truly just doing their best. They may be murderers, right? Like, it's hard to argue away from the 5 deaths, but they really want to prove, honestly, that Boston, for, like, in their eyes, Boston is what's on trial, right? And so those soldiers came to Boston because of all those riots, and they think the town of Boston has been smeared as a mobbish town. And their idea is to try to show that actually there Boston's not really a bad place. And somehow they have to get the soldiers off, and it becomes a very complicated story, right? Where they're trying to thread this very tiny needle to say, well, it's not really the fault of the soldiers, and it's not really the fault of the city, and so it's then a town. So they end up blaming these sort of outside agitators, which is perhaps a legal story we've seen before and since, where they say it's these soldiers, it's Crispus Attucks, right? It's apprentices and Irish people and people of color, not real Bostonians, right? So they play this card, which is a little difficult, to say, well, what the soldiers didn't have any choice, but they weren't real people, real Bostonians. We don't really care. And so, in fact, Adams does manage to get most of the soldiers off. But he does that by really denying that there's any connection between soldiers and civilians, right? And so that whole story of all of these marriages, all these families, all these godparents, that just disappears from the record. And so that's why we have never sort of seen it before.
We're going to get to audience questions in just a moment, but one final question from me. Were there any interesting threads that you found in the research that unfortunately you couldn't quite fit it in the book?
So many. So I do definitely want to have time for questions, but maybe I'll just talk about one at the very end. There are these 2 sisters who are the daughters of the imperial treasurer, right, of the Massachusetts treasurer. His last name was Thomas Flucker, and one of them marries somewhat famously Henry Knox, right? Becomes Lucy Knox. She becomes very well known. The other one marries a British officer, right? And I end my book by saying, these 2 sisters never see each other again, right? When British leave on evacuation day of 17, they'll leave eventually in 1776, and they, the Knox go one way, right? The Urquharts, that's the other one, go the other. But then when I did a little more digging, which didn't make it into the book, it turns out that Hannah and the other Flucker sister and James Urquhart don't have a great marriage, and they have this like crazy divorce in which he accuses her of having an affair with the Marine who takes her out of Boston. They have a child together, and the officer goes back to try to save the marriage in this kind of expat community in London, and it doesn't work. And all of these former colonial officials are all sort of talking smack, essentially, about the daughter of one of their friends. It's the most incredible. This divorce record is full of these depositions from all of these former imperial officials, and it is kind of amazing. And that's a story that I couldn't quite fit in there, but it's a story I have yet to tell.
A whole nother book. Well, thank you so much, Serena, and we'll open it up now to audience questions. You can text your question here. Here's our first one. What are we to make of the soldier's wife in the Bostonian home and her premonition that blood would spill?
Yeah. So those stories are collected, right? Those depositions are collected by the town of Boston the day after the shooting, and then they're carefully organized to try to show that this was a premeditated attack, right? That's going to be both the PR and the legal argument. And the degree to which these depositions, I mean, it's clearly hearsay, right? It's a guy who's like, I was sitting there in a kitchen and I overheard this other person say X, right? So it doesn't, right? The lawyers are like, yeah, I don't think this is great evidence. And I think it's not great evidence of premeditation. I think it's evidence of people sitting around in each other's kitchens talking. And I think it's evidence that people here and anticipated some kind of tension, right? But did it happen that day? I think there's nothing to prove that it did.
Our next question, were the British soldiers originally invited into local Bostonian homes, or were these families told by the Crown, you will take in these soldiers?
Right? No, they choose to rent. Like truly, it is like Airbnb, right? So people, and so lots of Sons of Liberty are renting out spaces, right? They have spaces, but really, Boston's had been in a depression since the end of the 7 Years' War. There's not a lot of money flowing, and so people are like, oh, I could use some cash. So no one, and they make the army pay pretty well. So no, this they're pretty happy to take it. I don't think there's any evidence of coercion.
Our next question, this was an interesting one that I meant to ask as well. Can you talk about Crispus Attucks, a free black man is famously remembered as the first martyr of the Revolution who was killed in the Boston Massacre?
Yeah. And so in this engraving, in the bottom right, engravings, right, are just sort of done and then they're hand colored later. And so different engravings show Attucks with different color. Right, it sort of depends on the person who's doing the coloring, which I think is super interesting. So so the question about what role Attucks plays in this, I think, is difficult because, like I was suggesting, I do think Adams plays a race card here, and it's a little ugly, right, to look at now, but the story of Attucks himself, I mean, there absolutely were soldiers were sailors on the street. He absolutely was a sailor. I think that much we know. Like, he's not made up out of whole cloth by Adams. Like, he really was a person. We have the coroner's report on him, although he has other names. I mean, he travels under many names, which is also unsurprising for someone who's both African descended and indigenous descended, right? So he's both, and he's from Massachusetts, town outside of Boston. So he's traveled through lots of cultures, right? He has lots of names. He comes to be known in a story that I really love as the first martyr of the revolution by a 19th century historian, one of the first Black historians to write in Boston, who writes a book called Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, in which he's trying to make an argument in the 1850s about why Massachusetts in particular, but white Americans in general should actually be supporting abolition, right? Where the argument he's trying to make is African descended people have been here from the beginning, right? And have a claim to the freedom of this country. And that is really why we need to be fighting the slave power of the 1850s. And so he's sort of the intellectual engine of abolition in Massachusetts and more largely in New England. He's the one that actually kind of recaptures the memory of Crispus Attucks and creates a whole sort of set of public programs around him. And in that way, I think the figure becomes far more inspiring than whatever it is that Adams did with his death, which is a different story.
I believe, Serena, that might be it, unless I'll just give it 5 more seconds to see if my tablet here refreshes on questions. I think that might be it. Serena, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
I'm going to invite Liv to come back up and give us closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Thank you all for joining us in the room. Again, please check out Serena's book in the bookshop, and she'll be signing copies in the lobby. Our next program is a screening of Star Wars: A New Hope in the Navajo language dub. So if you're interested, please join us. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.